I'm absolutely delighted to have Satin Mirchandani here tonight, who has so generously flown in from Philadelphia from another business trip to be with us, although was a resident of Austin, still owns a house here, and has his new business in Dallas, but we're eagerly awaiting his permanent return soon. But let me tell you a little bit about Satin. Satin is CEO of MD Byline. He is a serial entrepreneur and technology executive who has called Texas home since 1998. He currently serves as the CEO of Byline, a health care information service company headquartered in Dallas. Satin describes MD Byline as a cross between Consumer Reports, J.D. Power, and Gartner for the hospital sector, and is deeply engaged in transforming the 30-year-old business to take advantage of seismic shifts in the healthcare space. Before MD Byline, Satin co-founded Message One in 2002 and served as CEO until its acquisition by Dell in 2008. And I don't think I'm letting any secret out of the bag when I say that was for something close to $150 million. Message One was the leader in SaaS-based email continuity, security, and archiving services. Previously, as general partner at Impact Venture Partners, Satin focused on e-business services and next-generation enterprise applications and investments. Prior to Impact, Satin was Vice President of Business Development at PC Order, which many of you may recall was a publicly listed company, where he led the 1990 IPO process and launched the ASP model reseller business. He spent several years in McKinsey prior to that and company, in its technology practice from the mid-1990s, where he focused primarily on product, market strategy, and merger and acquisition. He began his career as a software design engineer at Microsoft Corporation, working on Microsoft Mail. Satin receives a BA in Computer Science and Economics from Dartmouth College, and he's a Phi Beta Kappa, and an MBA with honors from the Harvard Business School. He was honored with the 2008 Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award for Central Texas, and currently serves as a judge for the EOY program. Please welcome Satin here tonight.
Thanks, Laura. Is this too loud? Can you hear me okay? Right. Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you for being here today. Honestly, it's a pleasure to be here. I can't tell you how exciting it is to be able to share some of the stories. Sorry.
Yep.
How about that? Is that better?
Yeah, better. Sorry.
How's this? Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
It's great to be here. I see several friendly faces in the audience, people I've worked with for a number of years in some cases, and I'll embarrass them later as we go through this. But it's great to be here, and honestly, I'm here for a selfish reason. It's partly I've known Laura for actually well over a decade now, and have had the pleasure of collaborating with her on multiple efforts. In addition, honestly, it's important, I think, to every once in a while take a step back and remind yourself what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's worth doing. So I'm here as much for myself as for you guys, but thank you for being here. So with that, I thought before I got into some of the more prepared remarks, I'd just get a sense for the audience. Tell me this, how many folks in the room either have worked for or are currently working for a startup or a fast-growing young company? Wow, wow. And of the rest of you, how many think you might want to try it someday? A little less sure, okay. Well, this is terrific. It's great to see this level of excitement in Austin. I remember back in the, right after the dot-com bust, things got real tough here for a while. And it was very difficult to scare up people that wanted to do startups. So it's great to see that level of excitement. Before I get into some of the storytelling, I guess, I got a question, a little quiz for the audience. And Howard, you're not allowed to answer this question. Carrie, you're not allowed to answer it either. But I've got a question for everyone here. If I can get this thing to work. There we go. I'd like you to take a look at that and try and guess what that represents. So just take a moment to think about it. And just to make it interesting. Okay, any takers?
The economy?
Good try. Quick close. It's a good try. It's much more personal than that. Much smaller than that. What was the answer? Oh, thank you.
Well, you can tell when he's
Actually,
doing the
not far
startup.
off.
Yeah.
Not far off. All right. Well, let's break the suspense for you. It's very personal, and you're going to laugh. Well, I get a laugh when I look at it. This represents, over a period of 4.5 years, my personal body weight and body fat content. Now, why do you think this is interesting to me in the context of entrepreneurship? Here's why. This chart corresponds to some very big life events. So in 2008, shortly after Dell acquired MessageOne, I did a full physical checkup for the first time in probably 10 years. And the doctor said, you're 40 years old, you're going to have a coronary within 10 years, unless you do something very significant. So I did something very significant. I got with the program, I got on a diet, I hired a personal trainer. I went from an embarrassingly high weight and body fat content down to something that was actually pretty good. Perhaps went too far, bounced back, and then kind of stabilized for a while. And then in February of 2011, I took over this new gig as CEO of MD Byline, and everything just skyrocketed, right, in the wrong direction. A year later, we had twins. And once again, things skyrocketed. So I guess one of the takeaways here is, for those of you that have had babies and had twins, being a startup entrepreneur is not that hard. You've got it covered. Because if you look at the lines there, the line post-twins is a lot steeper than the line post-MD Byline. So if you've had kids, a startup should be a breeze for you. But quite seriously, this really does represent in many ways what it's like to be in a startup. Just another little picture. This picture was taken this morning at 6 o'clock Eastern as I took off from Philly Airport on my way to Chicago for a quick meeting, and then here this afternoon. It's beautiful, right? But it's 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern. I was up at 4, which means 3 Central. And it got better as the flight went on, and it was absolutely gorgeous. But this is the life of an entrepreneur. So why do we do this, right? Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we work so hard, constantly nonstop? Why do we, in many ways, unless we're really, really careful, kill our bodies? What is it that drives entrepreneurs? What is it about startups that makes it so compelling? The answer is different for each of us. People you've spoken to in the past will probably give you their version of things. Some people have amazing ideas, right? They literally can't sit still until they've formed a company around it, and I know people like that. In my case, it's a lot more pedestrian. I don't have any such explanation. I tend to get inspired by others. So the way I got into the startup business was completely by accident. I was on the corporate track. I had a computer science undergrad, as Laura mentioned. I was at McKinsey. I was on the corporate track. I thought I would, I was sitting in the Valley, consulting with all of the major high-tech companies, and very, very happy with what I was doing until I got this really interesting call from the founder of a startup here in town, Christy Jones, the CEO, the founder of PC Order. And it really it got me so fired up because I sensed in this person a passion for what they were doing and a desire to build a team that was genuinely world-class. So for me, my real brush with entrepreneurship happened 15 years ago now, in 1998. It caused me to move from San Francisco here to Austin to do something I had no idea how to do, but I just knew it was the right thing for me to be doing at that point in time. It was a heck of a ride. For those of you, how many of you know PC Order or have heard of PC Order? The old timers. Perhaps, at least up until that point in time, the single worst named company I'd ever run across in my life. Because of all the things you could do on PC Order's website, the one thing you couldn't do was to order a PC. We were in the business of helping all of the other PC manufacturers other than Dell streamline their supply chains. And so we had the entire order-to-cash cycle done. We helped them essentially re-engineer their processes and get super efficient, move onto the web. We called it moving the computer industry onto the web. That experience taught me the value of timing and picking a great market. This was a $25 million company that got to a $1.5 billion market cap, and we did it in spite of the biggest mistakes that have ever been made. We hired incorrectly, we sold incorrectly, we did not have a commitment to making customers successful. But as they say, pigs fly in a hurricane, and we found a hurricane, and honestly, we were a little bit of a pig, but we flew. And it was an amazing, amazing experience, but I look back on that, and sometimes it's valuable to see things done wrong to know how to do them right. But I walked away from that experience with tremendous, tremendous respect for Christy Jones, perhaps the single most courageous person I've ever met. She defined for me what an entrepreneur is, and in my mind, an entrepreneur is somebody who isn't fearless, but who has the ability to keep moving in spite of incredible fear. You could be scared shitless. Am I allowed to say that here?
We'll beep it out.
Christy defined the ability to not be paralyzed in spite of the fear. And to me, that is in many ways the true definition of an entrepreneur. And it's what inspired me to move on to the next thing. So my next thing was Impact Ventures with Adam Dell. Adam inspired me because of his ability to be a normal, regular guy and not have a chip on his shoulder, in spite of being the younger, much less famous brother of Michael Dell. Really good guy, really smart guy. Again, just was very comfortable with who he was, comfortable in his skin. That experience taught me, once again, the value of being in the right place at the right time, because this time it was on the downside. We went out to raise a venture fund in the fall of 2000. Perhaps the single worst time in the history of man to be raising a venture fund. But we had a hell of a time not raising money. We met with all of the LPs, gained an understanding of what they were looking for, and again, imbibed a lot of lessons. And to my point about being inspired by Adam, I'll never forget this dinner we had in New York where we were sitting just a couple tables away from this person who looked a little bit like Michael Jackson, but it wasn't Michael Jackson. And Adam just gets up, walks over, and says, "Hey, Tito, I know exactly how it feels. I have a really famous brother, too." Tito Jackson. These are some of the lessons you walk away with. But keeping it cool in the middle of what potentially could have been a real failure professionally was, again, a lesson I walked away with. And again, Adam, super cheerful, incredibly smart, very, very courageous guy. And forgive me if I'm rambling. I'm trying to give you a feel for what it's like to get introduced into the entrepreneur process, because I never intended to be an entrepreneur. I thought I was going to be a corporate executive somewhere. It was after working with Adam at Impact that I met this guy, Mike Rosenfeld, who truly inspired me. Mike was my business partner for over a decade, and Laura knows him well. Perhaps one of the most giving people I've ever met. He would do for others, for employees, for customers, without ever asking what he might be able to get in return, and particularly customers. I'll still remember the first few prospects we went to talk to, the design partners at Message One. These are people who were struggling with their email systems, didn't really understand how to articulate the problem. And Mike and I, and driven by Mike would spend hours and hours trying to understand who they were. It was all about empathy for him. It was trying to get into the customer's shoes to understand the pain that they were dealing with. And bit by bit, we started to understand phenomenologically how they thought about their problems. I mean, remember, this was post 9/11. Right? Most large organizations had been through a tremendous setback of one sort or another. And the stories that came out really began to create a really interesting picture for us, because what we realized was that even the largest banks in the world, the ones that were headquartered in New York or had significant operations in New York, were massively hit by 9/11. They thought they knew how to recover. And so they immediately shipped their employees over to New Jersey or Pennsylvania, wherever their backup sites were. They had cubes set up, they had computers set up, and they tried to get the employees to work. And then they realized the employees couldn't communicate with each other because they had no email. And that was the spark for Message One. It was working with Mike that we understood what the real issue was. Email was so widespread, after decades and decades of germinating, it finally got to a point where every enterprise was using email, using it in a massively intensive way. It was hugely fragmented, multiple points of failure, and when it went down, nobody knew what to do about it. So from all of that, all of those conversations came just a really, really simple idea. And our promise to the customer was, if your email ever goes down, we will replace it within 30 seconds or less. You will have a functioning email system within 30 seconds, regardless of what caused the outage in the first place. Whether it was a server going down, or a virus, or some sort of malware corruption, or a jackass with a backhoe that cuts the line to your data center, or a replication problem with high-end storage, it doesn't matter. We'll replace it within 30 seconds, and we'll do it for a fraction of the cost of any of the alternatives. And the reason we were able to do that is because, again, I attribute this to Mike, the ability to listen carefully to the customer and understand what mattered to them and what didn't matter. What the traditional mainstream disaster recovery folks had concluded was that if your primary email system goes down, you want a fully functioning, identical copy firing up as quickly as possible. Turns out that's not the case. There's a real distinction between email service, which is the ability to send and receive emails, and your data store. And what customers told us was, in the hours, the days after a massive outage, I don't necessarily have to have my entire inbox, gigs and gigs of emails going back years and years, available to me right away. What I do need, though, is functioning email flow back and forth. And so what we did was very simple. We just replicated a functioning email system with very little of the core data in it. And that decreased our cost dramatically to a point where we were typically 1/10 of the cost of any of the alternatives. I realize I'm going into a lot of detail with this explanation, but you can't get to this level of understanding unless you sit down with customers and have empathy for them and who they are and how they do their jobs. And that's something I learned from my partner in crime at Message One, and I've tried to. Go ahead, Laura.
And I was going to say, so it is one of the messages here, if you can get with your customer even before you have your product or as you develop your product, highly valuable?
Incredibly valuable. Would recommend you never do it any other way. You've got to get something out in the marketplace and you got to test it, but the only way to figure out what the key attributes of that are is to talk to your customers. And it's not about going broad to 50 or 100 customers, it's about getting 4 or 5 and going really deep with them.
And who were the first 4 or 5 where you kind of went deep? Can you share them?
Sure. Some of the names will escape me, but I'll try to share the best I can. One of them was GSDM, the ad agency here in town. Massive, intensive users of email. They had, I think, 2,000 employees worldwide, maybe more at the time. And they sent massive files, graphic files and pictures and so on and so forth, back and forth. And so their reliance on email back when there was no Dropbox and there was no Box.net was incredibly high. So they cared. It was truly mission critical for them. That was one. We had a large real estate services company whose name escapes me, but got acquired by C.B. Richard Ellis. And Howard may remember who they were. Insignia Corp, that's who it was. Insignia Corporation that got bought by C.B. Richard Ellis was one of our design partners. Siemens Business Services, large multinational. All very different use cases, right? All very different use cases. They all thought about email differently, but it was, the common thread was it was critical to all of their operations.
Great, thank you.
So as I look back on the Message One opportunity, I mean, this is a company, we went from 6 people to 200 in a period of 6 years. I looked at the numbers this morning because it's been 5 years since the company got bought, and it took a little bit of refreshing to go back and remember those days. We grew at 109% annually, year over year, for 6 years. So we went from 0 to close to $50 million in bookings over a 6-year period. Think of what that means organizationally. Think of what that means from a recruiting perspective. When you're interviewing somebody, you're not interviewing them for the job that's available on that day. You're interviewing them for the next 2 jobs, because within a year they'll be doing, a job that's 2 or 3 times as big as it was that you hired them for. So when we hired, it was all about character, talent, and motivation. It was much less about experience, because we could teach them the nature of the job. It wasn't that hard, by and large. It was very important, though, to hire people that were truly motivated to be part of something that was growing that quickly. Because that level of hypergrowth brings a set of challenges, and it creates a set of tension within an organization that takes a lot of commitment to get past.
I actually remember when I came to Message One as an EY judge to be judging the Entrepreneur of the Year. And I always like to go around the company and see what the culture is like within the company. And clearly the culture is an outcropping of the attributes you've just mentioned in hiring and the culture that you desire to try and create. Was that very purposeful?
I'd like to be revisionistic and say it was,
But
the reality is we just look for like-minded people that were fired up, right? They saw the opportunity that we saw, and they just couldn't wait to get started. I remember feeling that way back in '98 when Christy Jones hired me, and I had a visa issue, so I had to wait 2 months before I could start working. I was still in the Valley at the time, and she came out to meet with some customers, and we had lunch. And she goes, so, what are you thinking? It's going to be a couple months before you start. How do you feel? And I just said, Christy, I can't wait to get started. This just is, it's a huge opportunity. I'm so fired up. I'm sure I'll screw up along the way, but I'm just so excited to get started. That was what we look for in people above all else, because that is the level of passion that it takes to get past the day-to-day hurdles. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. Startups and little companies are honestly totally screwed up. Most of them are totally screwed up. And it's because they have no history. They have relatively little culture beyond the founders, unless it's been very purposeful. And most of them aren't, regardless of what they tell you. And they have no precedent, and they have very little in terms of baked processes. So what you're relying on a day-to-day basis is people who are passionate about the business, are smart, and have good judgment. Right? So you need to be able to rely on people that are at the front line. And so you've got to have that filter in place before they ever come aboard.
right.
So you get all fired up.
I can tell. But that passion, how do you convey that to the other people you're working with? Do they kind of get it? Do they just have their own passion? Is it something that by observing you, and I'd further ask, in each of these endeavors, you had a partner. And that puts a different dynamic on things. It's not like a one-person CEO leader on their own is a partner. Perhaps you can address those things.
It's and I'll take them in reverse order.
Yep.
Primarily because I've forgotten the first one, so I'll answer the second and you can remind me what the first one was. This is a really important point. We live in a culture that idolizes, deifies a founder or a CEO. Very, very rarely do you see an organization that is primarily driven by one person or a very small group of people. It really does take a village. The greatest boon to a terrific startup is the ability to transmit culture through action and through visible trade-offs. And when I say visible trade-offs, what that means is in a moment of crisis, biting the bullet and doing the right thing even though it's not expedient. We had this issue at MessageOne several times. In one instance, we had a customer that failed over to our backup system, and our backup system didn't work. And it took us 3 months to recover from that because this was a massive, massive failure on the customer's part. So think of it this way. When you go to sell to a company, right, typically the person who buys is not a company, they're a person. They're buying from another person. They buy because they believe that what you're offering them has value and that when they need you, you're going to come through for them. The single greatest reason startups aren't able to sell to enterprises is because of the personal career risk that is represented to the person who's buying. If I'm trying to sell you software and you work at General Motors, the single greatest, even if it's the coolest software in the world, the reason you're not going to buy it from me if you don't is because I'm unknown to you. My ability to recover in the event of a failure, my ability to come through and make you look good in your job, right, is a question mark. But buying from Microsoft or buying from SAP doesn't carry those question marks. We were faced with a situation like that. This was actually MFS Investment Management up in Boston. Their COO had purchased our product. They had a massive failure. They failed over to us. We had a massive failure. And so they were without email for, I can't remember how long it was, a day and a half, which in the investment management business is huge because you have thousands of advisors whose calendars are online. And so if their calendars go offline, they don't know who they're supposed to be meeting with. Their entire business comes to a standstill. And so at that point, Mike and I, and we did this together, drop of a hat, when we realized how bad the issue was, we dropped everything else. We dropped the sales cycles we were involved with, we dropped the product development meetings we were in, we hopped on a plane, got to Boston, and literally camped outside the office of the COO, did a mea culpa, offered to, we went to the back with a description of what had occurred, what the root cause was, how we were going to solve it, offered to present ourselves to her boss, and essentially take responsibility for the problem we created because we wanted to shield her from the situation. This disrupted our business for probably a week, maybe longer, and Howard was around at the time. But it's just the right thing to do. And when 100 people watch you do that, they realize how committed you are to the business, and they realize what matters.
What was the reaction of the customer?
She was angry beyond belief. And the sentiment was, I can't believe I was stupid enough to take a bet on you guys. And at some level, that was a very genuine sentiment. By the time we were done, though, we'd recovered. We had taken on responsibility. We offered them, I think it was years, was it 1 year? 1 year of free service. And they turned into one of our best case studies ever. Because it's not, every business screws up, every individual screws up. It's how you recover, it's how you react, it's whether you do the right thing or not. So her reaction was very strong, very emotional. But she came back around and realized that we were committed to making her look good eventually.
And the partnership with both you and Mike going, the two of you, you were the CEO, Mike was the president, but you were almost interchangeable.
We were interchangeable in situations like that. I personally believe, I've never met the perfect CEO or the perfect founder. The person doesn't exist. The range of skills you need in order to do your job well and to grow a startup to fulfill its manifest destiny is so broad that you need multiple people. And so some people do it with 2 or 3 or 4 founders. In our case, we did it with the 2 of us. We were very complementary. As you can tell, I'm conservative, buttoned down, analytical. That's the way I think about things. Mike is a whirling dervish of energy. He's all about passion and emotion, and we made a really good match. And I've had partnerships like that, less intense, less long-lived, and I found that that's always, for me, that has worked really well, because it's allowed me to have a 360-degree view of the organization. Honestly, it's allowed the partnership to have an impact that goes way beyond what I can do. I mean, there are certain things I'm just not that good at, and I won't get into that in a lot of detail. But there are things I just don't enjoy doing. Sometimes, you have to deal with personnel problems and personal problems, and sometimes I don't have a lot of patience for that. In this case, Mike had all the time in the world. Well, he's just a much more empathetic guy than I am.
We saw your chart on those things, I think. But if you will, how did you and Mike come together in terms of, did you look for a partner? Did you just come together accidentally? Did you?
Chemistry. It was completely accidental. And after a couple of meetings and a couple of pitches together, we realized that we were literally completing each other's sentences, even though we had completely different backgrounds. At that point in time, I was on my 2nd startup, but really my personal first startup. Mike had been through 3 or 4 startups, had a very colored and checkered career. He had been expelled from both Georgetown and UT, which is quite an accomplishment. to be expelled from Georgetown for conduct unbecoming the Jesuit tradition is something that's really quite spectacular. So we're poles apart, but we found ourselves completing each other's sentences. And so I think it's one of those things where we just both knew. We looked at each other and we just knew that we were both stronger with the other.
Post-Message 1, you both decided to go in different directions?
We did. Very regretfully, we've gone in totally different directions. Mike, always the smart one, decided that after 8 years of completely ignoring his family, he was gonna place his family first. He moved with his family, 2 little kids, great little boys. Moved to Costa Rica right after he got done with Dell, and stayed 2 years in Costa Rica in this beautiful villa by the ocean. How it has been, I haven't. I'm told it's spectacular. He then moved to Phoenix a couple of years ago because there's an amazing charter school, I'm told, where his wife, who was a pediatrician, wanted to enroll the kids. And so he went completely the family domestic route and is available as an advisor to me, but he's really off the professional grid. I did something completely different. We had no kids at the time, and so we took a bunch of time off, traveled around Europe, realized that neither one of us could not be doing something from a professional perspective. So I started this new gig, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And we also decided to start a family. So it's been a pretty amazing journey for us. MD Byline, which is the company that I started at 2 years ago, is totally different from anything I've ever done. It's a 30-year-old company. It is focused in the healthcare space and is really designed to help hospitals make better decisions. I know that sounds really diffuse, but think of the following. Let's say you're a supply chain director in a hospital. You buy 5,000 items of stuff in the course of a month. The person negotiating across the table from you is from Johnson & Johnson or Synthes or GE, and they sell one SKU, and they sell it to everybody. Their level of knowledge is up here. Your level of knowledge is down here. MD Byline was founded by a husband-wife couple in order to level the playing field. Their job was to make sure, our job is to make sure that when that supply chain person or that finance person in a hospital is sitting face to face with the vendor, that they are armed with all of the information they need to select the right product, to get a good price on it, and to make sure that the T's and C's that they've negotiated are appropriate for the hospital. So if you think about this, at some level it's a vast democratization of the hospital's capital equipment space. If you're in the market for an MRI or an ultrasound machine, you haven't bought one in 6 or 7 years. How do you know what you need? If you're in the consumer space, you go to Consumer Reports, or you go to J.D. Power, and you read reviews, you read user ratings, you read satisfaction ratings, and then you see what the price ranges are that you should be paying. And that's really what MD Byline does. We're used by over half the hospitals in the country, who will typically send us the quotes as they're negotiating the quotes. So we have this giant database where we get to see more than half of all the capital equipment that transacts in the country. So when you call us and say, look, I'm looking to buy the GE Centricity, whatever, right then and there we can tell you within a 5 or 10% band what you should be paying for it and what accessories you need. This seems like it's a very detailed, granular business, but if you think about what we're doing at the end of the day, we're helping an industry that has gone from, in my working career, from less than 10% of GDP to 18% today, and on its way to 25%. And we just don't get enough bang for the buck. Right? Our healthcare dollars are just not spent well. We spend twice as much as the next country, have outcomes that are 10th or 12th on the list. Our entire healthcare system is broken from an economic perspective. And so what we at MD Byline are doing is trying to help bridge that gap. We're trying to help contain the cost of healthcare at the same time that the folks in a clinical setting are driving towards better outcomes. It is this endeavor that I'm part of right now has as much meaning or more than anything I've ever done. Because if we do our jobs correctly, we're contributing to better patient care. It's an amazing group of people. Some of them have been at the company for well over 20 years. These are former clinicians. These are people that have been on the hospital floor. They've operated the equipment. They know what they're talking about when they advise our customers. And they're deeply passionate about the impact that our work can have on the delivery of patient care. So for us and for me to make the big step, to move from Austin to Dallas, I know, think about that. To voluntarily move from Austin to Dallas. It was really hard to do, but it's an endeavor I'm truly passionate about. It is something that has the potential to fundamentally change the cost of care, and we're really excited about it.
You know, one of the unusual things here is you as an entrepreneur have dealt with 3 completely different businesses. It's like you don't want to do the same business again. Do you get bored?
I have ADD. No, I don't. Well, if I do, no one's told me specifically. No, I've always enjoyed the intellectual challenge. I've always, to me, what tends to attract me, aside from people who inspire me, are really, really hard problems. Because all massive amounts of value get created by people focusing on genuinely tough problems. And so I'm relatively agnostic. I've done technology stuff, I've done consulting stuff. Now in healthcare, it's a messed up ecosystem. Healthcare is broken for the largest industry in the country to be as much of a cottage industry as it is. It's just beyond belief. And so I'm excited about it, I'm passionate about it, and can't wait to help sort things out.
I'd like to start opening this up to the audience. And if you have a question, if you don't mind going to one of the 2 mics, we'd like to get your questions to Satin. Please.
You mentioned earlier that you learned a lot of lessons when fundraising, especially during 2000. Would you be willing to share some of those lessons that you've learned, and what advice would you give to individuals looking to raise money for a venture fund right now, or just fundraising in general for a company?
And when you say raising money for a venture fund, do you mean actually starting a venture fund, or doing a startup and looking for venture capital?
I'd say both. Go ahead and give advice for
Okay.
if you were looking for a venture fund or something similar, and also for startup as well.
Okay, so on the first, which is the venture fund, the advice is very simple. Don't. Seriously, don't. The best venture capitalists in the world are people like Laura. People who have been operators or entrepreneurs or involved with startups, have lived through the battles, who understand what it takes to make a venture successful before they get into the venture business. That's not to say that some people don't succeed going a different route, but it's the odds are lower. The likelihood that you end up having a series of misses and having no idea why you missed is actually pretty high. So please don't start a venture fund, okay?
Or go get some experience first.
Exactly, go get some experience. So moving on to the second one. I'll try to perhaps answer the question with a question. Does anyone know why startups get funded?
They need to grow really fast.
No, let me rephrase it. Sorry, I didn't answer the question. I didn't ask the question correctly. Not why do they look for funding, but when a startup receives a term sheet, when a startup gets funding from a venture capital, why did they receive that particular term sheet or get that round of venture capital? Go ahead, sir.
Because the founders?
That's definitely an element of it. There are others as well. But transactionally, when a venture capitalist gives you a term sheet, why are they doing it? Sorry, can I see hands just so I can call on the person? Yes, sir?
They want to make profit.
They do want to make a profit, but they could make a profit on other deals as well. Why does your deal get the benefit of the term sheet?
Because there's a need for the service or product in the market.
All of that is true. Here's why. Yes, Howard, go ahead.
Somebody else wants to do it.
Because somebody else wants the deal. The VC wants the deal they can't have. Okay? So the most important thing you can do as an entrepreneur is make sure you understand what you're pitching. Go to the person you're most likely to get the term sheet from, and then at that point you've got a decision to make. You either go with the one that gave you the term sheet, which is generally what I recommend, because the first person that gives you the term sheet is the one that understands what you're trying to do. Everybody else that piles on after that is only giving you the term sheet because that first one gave it to you. Laura, what are your thoughts on this topic?
I tend to, in every industry there's leaders and followers. And in this particular industry, leaders are extremely high risk takers, but they're very calculated risk takers. So the gentleman who said team, I absolutely agree. Team is critical, and size of market opportunity is critical. And then after that, I say it's up to individual preferences as what the other key elements to the business are. But yes, it's amazing how quickly the company can get multiple offers of funding once the first term sheet is down. But without that first term sheet, it may take months to get that funding.
Crickets chirping.
Crickets chirping.
It's amazing. Back to your point, though, about the team and the market opportunity. I get asked this a lot. I used to ask it a lot. I don't know the answer, right? Which one's more important? It's so circular. If you have awesome people, they'll find a big market. Right? If you have a crappy market, the best people can't do well in it, but they'll find a way to morph. So at some level, that would suggest that perhaps it's the people, but I've seen amazing people spend years and years flailing at something that honestly was just more nuanced than they expected it to be. So ideally, you want both, but if you have to pick between the two, pick the people, because they can change the market. The market can't change the people.
Absolutely. I think the people are more important than the product almost. Other questions we may have? And please feel free to come up to the mic so that we're ready as we go along. So,
what is MD Byline's plan or opinion on the privatization of the healthcare industry, and how would that affect your business model?
It's a deep question. So in the best spirit of taking issue with the question, I guess I would submit that the industry hasn't necessarily been more privatized or less privatized recently. It's just been given new guardrails. That said, though, the essence of your question stands, which is the industry is going through massive tumult right now. You've got a set of mandates that are, in some instances, mandated experiments in 50 different states, and you've got hard deadlines that have to be met. And honestly, not a lot of people know what to do with it. From our perspective, very micro, very selfish, from our perspective, for the first time in 30 years, we face a buyer that actually cares about the economics of what they're buying. For the first time, hospitals actually care about the cost of the widget that they're buying or the machine that they're putting you under. So from our perspective, it's a huge positive, because our ability to impact the outcome, the financial outcome, is just as strong as it ever was. But now on the other side of the table, in the form of a customer, we've got a hyper-motivated customer because they've been given a mandate to cut 5 or 10 or 15% out of their cost structure. Now, sometimes they think we're part of that 5 or 10 or 15%, so that makes for an interesting conversation. But more often than not, we're able to really deliver significant dollars for them. We think this is a great time for us, and PACA or ACA or Obamacare, whatever you choose to call it, is a huge catalyst for our business.
So you think Obamacare is creating somewhat of a market-driven effect? And I don't mean from a political perspective, but just causing a market to become more opportunistic for entrepreneurs?
The short answer is yes.
Right.
When I was in my senior year in college, I was interviewed by this investment banker from Drexel, Burnham Lambert. Some of you may remember that name. The interview happened about 6 months before they went under, and he said, "It's a chaotic time, but where there's chaos, there's opportunity." And then they went under 6 months later. But the essence of what he said is true. Where there's chaos, there's opportunity. When there's a catalyst, when there's massive movement in the marketplace, there's typically an opportunity for disruptors to come along and fundamentally change things. Never in my life have I seen an industry this large go through so much mandated change so quickly. A lot of us were around in the early and the mid-90s, in the bad old days of managed care, when supposedly HMOs were going to take over the world, but nothing happened. Hillary Care came and went. Nothing happened. And the reason is because politically we weren't able to get our act together. Whether you believe that's a good thing or not, put that issue aside, we did not create a set of mandates and the catalyst that we have right now. So we have enormous change. We have enormous ambiguity as to what the right winning models are. And for the first time, you see healthcare providers and payers getting together and taking very big calculated risks, whether it's the creation of ACOs or the expansion of networks across geographic territories in order to take on more risk. You've got massive changes going on. So I literally, in healthcare, there's never been a better time.
Other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for being here. My question is, what's the biggest challenge you had to overcome to get your businesses off the ground?
Yes. It's a great question. I've got so many. My propeller is just spinning right now. But at its core, it's about the people. It's about figuring out where you are as an organization or as an idea, to then understand what the group of talent is that needs to be assembled around it. The toughest part has always been finding people who get it. And I know that sounds like it's a very loose term, it's hard to define, but it's about finding people that intuitively understand the scope of what you're trying to deliver against, the scope of the problem you're trying to solve, and can find it within themselves to get excited, to really pour themselves into it and apply good judgment. So, I know that's a very long answer, but it's about finding great, committed people that you can trust. Because the only way an idea becomes a startup, becomes a company, becomes a giant enterprise, is if you have the ability to share a sense of mission and to trust, because trust is the core of scaling. And if you can't trust somebody's judgment, you can't really trust them to go do their job and to take on more and more of your job. So it's about finding people who have the innate ability to get it. I'm sorry, that's hard to define, but that's just the reality.
So do you immediately give that person trust once you've hired them because they meet your prior statement of character, talent, and motivation? Or do you have to observe them for a while before you convey that trust to them?
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both. You give them enough rope, let them go show you what they can do. The best people want to be set free. They want to be given a big giant objective, and they want to have the freedom to go execute against it. But you've got to watch, and you've got to provide feedback, and you've got to do it early, because the sooner you can catch a divergence, the more likely that it ends up being back into convergence. So it's both.
So when you find there's not the right fit of the person you thought in the company, how would you typically handle that?
It's not the employee's fault. It's my fault. At Message One, we had 4 VPs of sales before we finally found the right person. Now, the 3 that preceded that right person weren't the wrong person. They weren't the wrong VP of sales. They'd been very successful at other organizations, and they were very successful after Message One. What I did a particularly poor job of was understanding where we were and what our needs were versus the characteristics of the person we were looking for. So I think it starts with understanding that the company has made a mistake, and that the founder or the CEO has made a mistake. And if you approach the conversation from that perspective, it allows you to either redirect the person and put them on a path towards success, or candidly coach them out, but do it in a positive, constructive way. Because, I mean, the reality is, again, most people you hire are probably good people. They're probably good at something, right? They just happen to not be good at the role you put them in. So you look for another role, etc. But you've got, I believe this very strongly, you've got to approach it from the perspective of it being the company's fault because we didn't assess the fit correctly.
Do you think that's typical for most entrepreneurs?
I think most good ones get there.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to get there. Again, I'll tip my hat to Mike. He got this from day one. I've learned from him and people like Christy who understand that this is an art more than a science. And we've got to be forgiving towards the people. You've got to be hard on the problem, hard on the process, easy on the people.
That's great, thank you. Sir?
Satin, I understand MD Byline is 30 years old, you said?
Yes, the company was founded in 1983.
So what were they doing before, and what are you doing different now?
Okay. Great question. The company was, when I got to MD Byline, the company was doing a great job solving a part of the cost containment problem. They were focused specifically on capital equipment, which, if you think about where a hospital spends their money, they spend about half their money on staff, salaries and benefits. Of the other half, and Rachel is smiling because she's heard me say this before, of the other half, they spend about 10% on capital equipment, 20% on what's called consumables, implants, hips, knees, stuff that goes into the body, and then another 20% on what's called purchase services. We have set our sights on being the advisor for the CFO on all the stuff, the non-salaries and benefits that hospitals spend their money on. So if we do our jobs right, our addressable market grows by about 5-fold. We also plan to go international. And that's not going to happen immediately because we have some resource constraints. Again, it comes down to people. Finding like-minded people who live in Hong Kong or Dubai, it's kind of hard to do. But our goal right now is to move from a product perspective more broadly across the continuum, to move from capital into consumables, which we started a 1.5 years ago, and into other categories, to go deeper with more of a clinical bent, and then to venture outside the US because it turns out people abroad fall ill too. Concept.
Other questions?
In my experience, I've seen startups run into some problems when they reach a certain level of success where maybe the founders become disinterested, employees expect a certain level of growth, markets mature, things like that. Have you seen this or dealt with this? And what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. A lot of companies get to this point. Arguably, MD Byline was at this point 2 years ago. It was again, 30-year-old company. The founders, husband-wife couple, had moved to Napa Valley 10 or 12 years ago. They'd never been to the company for the past, I think, 2 years or 2.5 years. And it was a great little lifestyle business, right? They were off in their dream location. I mean, bless them, they did a great job. So I mean, kudos to them for creating what for them was the right entity. But when I got to MD Byline 2 years ago, it was a pretty sleepy place. Great people, very passionate about the work they were doing, but the aperture was pretty narrow, right? The absent significant change introduced at that point, they would be doing the same thing 5 years from now as they were doing 5 years ago. So I've seen that. It's actually harder to change a culture than it is to build a culture. I've been part of building cultures for about 10, 12 years now. Changing culture is harder because you have people who have the muscle memory of success and they don't want to change it. Not because they're bad people, but because they know that what they do works. And so you've actually got to convince them to change and develop new muscles, and they start, you know, there's a lot of muscle burn involved with that. But it comes down to, a lot of this starts with painting a vision for what the organization could be. I believe we could be 10 times the size we are, and this organization could go public. How do you get there? Well, you expand into these new categories I just talked about. You have deeper clinical outcome-related impact. You start moving internationally. All of a sudden, the light bulbs start going off. People start seeing, you start winning some really big deals that hadn't been the case a year ago or 2 years ago. And all of a sudden, people start believing, they go, wait a second, we could be so much bigger and so much more impactful than we are today. And it's not all about the money. You know, sure, the money matters, but it's about painting a vision based in reality, or based in some credible reality as to what you could be. Right? And then communicating and communicating again, and then over-communicating constantly. You can't communicate enough. Just can't.
You know, money is always talked about as the measurement of success. But is it what one would go in thinking about at the beginning, or only thinking about at the end of the process?
So this is important. Please listen carefully. There are a lot easier ways to make a lot of money than to do a startup. Go be an investment banker. There's 5 other professions behind it. If you're in it for the money, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. If you end up with a lot of money, that's great, right? It's wonderful, but the odds are stacked against you. The laws of physics are stacked against little companies competing against big companies. I forget what the stats are, but only one out of five startups ends up succeeding.
Yes.
By the way, 80% infant mortality, if you will, in the first couple of years.
Yep.
So if you're in it largely for the money, go do something else. So you know what? Go join a company that's already growing really quickly, right? And contribute what you can. Don't do a startup because you've got dollar signs in your eyes, because it's going to be too hard. Because there will be moments when you have to look deep within yourself and question whether what you spent the last year, 2 years, 3 years working on is fundamentally sound or not. And if you can't, I'm going to quote Christy Jones, if you can't fake it till you make it, you're going to drop out. I had this great conversation with Christy about a month after I started at BC Order, where we worked together on a Saturday afternoon to come up with all the stuff we had to do in order to go public and to solidify our book of business. And at the end of it, I was so overwhelmed. I looked at Christy, I'm like, Christy, how do you do it? How do you handle this? Without missing the beat, she goes, I drink heavily. It's the life of an entrepreneur. I'm kidding, you don't have to drink heavily, but there are a lot of moments of real doubt. There are a lot of moments of real doubt. The path is not well understood. And honestly, one of the reasons I'm here is because I need the little booster shot of inspiration as well, and it's kind of fun to be here and think of some of the lessons that I've learned and reminisce about some of those memories, because it gets me more fired up about what I'm doing today. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's from the heart.
I think that does. Any other questions? Because I have one last one. You are what we call a serial entrepreneur. You've done it once and twice and 3 times now. It seems to me that it's a rare trait to have an entrepreneur who not only has achieved their entrepreneurship goals on more than one occasion, actually keeps going at doing more companies. Why?
It's the definition of insanity. You do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. No, I love it. I love the process. It's a lot of fun. Where else do you have the ability to take on giant problems that have remained unsolved for, in this case, generations, and take a crack at it with the possibility, microscopic, but a possibility nevertheless, that you might emerge out the other end with a massive impact on an industry this large. It's just, it's too much fun to not do.
Thank you. I think on that note, it's too much fun not to do. So we look to many of you to become entrepreneurs in the future. Please join me in thanking Satin Mirchandani for coming here tonight.